Welcome to another session of ICAAC Live, coming to you from San Francisco, California. ICAAC is the infectious diseases annual meeting put on by the American Society for Microbiology. I'm your host for this and several other sessions. I'm Jeffrey Fox, the features editor of Microbe, which is the monthly magazine of ASM, the American Society for Microbiology. For those of you who are watching and listening over the web to this session, you'll be able to ask questions by using Twitter with hashtag ICAAC, or you can use the ASM newsroom. For those of you in the room who would like to ask a question, we ask that you raise your hand, wait for a microphone, and then identify yourself by name and institution. And I am reminded to say that once we get going, you don't have to wait for a question and answer session. Just ask whenever you're ready to pose your question. Now, this session is devoted to measles, and with me are two guests, two scientists. One, Gaston Dessert at my far left from the, oh no, I'm going to say it in the English style, Institut National de Santé Publique du Québec, Quebec, Canada. Well, a little mixture there of accents. And sitting to his right, my left, Jane Seward of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. Let's get going, if you would, our guest from Canada, to give a little overview of your findings and emphasizing the new findings, and then we'll give Jane Seward a chance to summarize her work, and we'll begin our conversation that way. Okay. Go ahead.
Good. So in 2011, in Canada, there was a lot of measles, and this measles was concentrated in Quebec, so in the eastward province. And in Quebec, in fact, this outbreak occurred in the center of the province in a rural area, and involved more than 700 cases, which is a lot given what we had in the previous years. And this outbreak started in a school, and this high school we investigated. It was a high school with 1,300 students, and about 8.4% of the students got the disease. So we wanted to know if it was a problem of low vaccine coverage or if it was a problem with the vaccine. And what we found was about half of the cases were twice vaccinated previously, so they were vaccinated. But in that school, there was about 5% of students who were not vaccinated. So 5% is a lot. And what we found is even if half of the cases were twice vaccinated, in fact, the risk in those who were vaccinated was 20 times lower than those who were unvaccinated. So the effectiveness of the vaccine was 94%. 94% is good, but what we found and what we're surprised was that if your first dose of vaccine, of the measles vaccine, was given at 12 months of age as recommended, and in Canada, in Quebec, the schedule is the first dose at 12 months and the second dose at 18 months, so a 6-month interval. So if you were vaccinated according to this schedule, the effectiveness was 93%. Whereas in students who received their 2 doses after 15 months of age, then the protection was much greater, 97.5%. So the risk in those who had received their 2 doses at 15 months and older was 3 times smaller, those who had received at 12 months had a risk 3 times greater than those who had received their first dose at 15 months or older. So this was absolutely unexpected, and we were wondering if this was an effect specific to that school or if it was something more generalized. So in the study we're reporting here, we looked at the cases outside this initial outbreak school and looked if the same greater risk in children who had received their first dose early was also seen. And so we had 61 twice vaccinated cases who participated to that study. We had 5 controls and found that in the high school, it was 3 times higher. In those cases outside the high school, it was 6 times greater. So the same relationship that the age at first dose, if it was younger, so 12 or 13 months of age, also was evident in the rest of the population. But again, that population was concentrated in the center of the province. So what was reported here is really that we did not find this only in the first high school, but also in the rest of this big outbreak.
Okay, good. And Jane?
I'm presenting this afternoon at a session to give a broad global overview of measles. And my talk is titled Global Measles, What's Next? I'm going to be talking about the huge disease burden and mortality that was caused by measles in the pre-vaccine era. Before the measles vaccine was available, more than 2 million children died of measles every year in the world. 15 to 60,000 children ended up blind, and a lot of others ended up with serious complications, including disabilities from brain infection or encephalitis. Measles vaccine's been available in the world since 1963. It's been widely used throughout the world since the 80s and 90s. In 1995, Millennium Development Goal number 4 set a goal for reducing under 5 mortality in children by 95% by 2015. And one of the big efforts towards that goal has been reducing deaths from measles. And so in 2000, at the sort of beginning of efforts towards reducing mortality in children, measles caused probably 700,000 to 800,000 deaths a year. There were a lot of accelerated efforts through the Measles Initiative in the first decade of this millennium to deliver the first dose of measles vaccine on time, to deliver a second dose of measles vaccine to as many children as possible, and then to improve case management. So there have been tremendous achievements over this last decade. Measles deaths have dropped 74% from 2000 to 2010. Nevertheless, about 140,000 children are estimated to still die of measles every year in 2010. That's 380 children a day still now die of measles. Measles vaccine is very effective, as you just heard from Gaston, in preventing measles deaths, and it's very cheap and cost-effective. It costs less than $1 to vaccinate and protect children from both measles and rubella together. And so there's a big effort now with some renewed funding from the Global Alliance of Vaccines and Immunization and partnerships with the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the Red Cross, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to accelerate efforts now from 2012 to 2020 to really essentially eliminate measles and rubella, with the vision for the world, a world without measles and rubella. And so it's an exciting time. We've achieved a tremendous amount for with measles, but there's still a lot to do. And I'll just leave it there. There's a lot more I could say, but...
Sure. Good. Let me start with a question that kind of will to ask the two of you to think about whether the experience you're describing in Quebec with the time at which the vaccine is administered to children, whether that is generalizable? Is there a comparable global impact? And if so, does Gavi, whoever is controlling and administering the vaccine globally, need to adjust the schedule for children, excuse me, worldwide to make sure that it's at its most effective?
Right. Why don't I take it? I'll talk first about that, if that's all right with Gaston. The current recommended age of the first dose of measles vaccine from WHO is 9 months. And the second dose is given at any time after 12 months. And that's sort of a balance between reducing deaths, because when measles is common, it's extremely severe in children and in infants. And so it's a balance between getting the first dose as early as possible to decrease deaths and as late as possible to get the best immune response. So at the moment, I mean, the achievements in the last decade with dramatic declines in measles mortality were done through the schedule of giving the first dose at 9 months. I think at this stage of the global program, it wouldn't be a consideration to move up to 15 months. I think over the next decade, certainly the World Health Organization will be looking at the optimal age for the first dose as we get down to very low levels of measles.
Well, yeah. Would you like to respond to?
I guess one thing that people need to know is the measles vaccine is a live vaccine. And the reason why we give it at 12 months is because before that age, it doesn't work as well. And the reason for that was primarily interference with maternal antibodies. So during pregnancy, children receive antibodies from their mothers, and these antibodies are there to protect the children during the period at highest risk of severe disease. Well, when these antibodies are still present when you give the vaccine, the antibodies destroy the virus, the vaccine virus, and therefore the vaccine doesn't work. So you have to find the age where the antibodies are not present and then vaccinate. But the problem is we know that even in absence of maternal antibodies, if you vaccinate children, let's say at 6 months of age or 9 months of age, children with no antibodies, the response will improve with older age. And even at 12 months, we see the immune response is better in children who had no antibodies compared to 9-month infants who have no antibodies. So maturation of the immune system probably plays a role. So maternal antibody is the core mechanism interfering with protection, but probably other factors play a role. So when there was a 2-dose schedule, it was to really fill the gap of those who were not protected by the first dose, and then the second dose to make sure that everybody would be protected. And the surprise we had was that even in those who had 2 doses, there was a vulnerability that was unexpected. With the studies done in infants who were given 1 dose and then the second dose a few months later, we saw almost no one without antibodies. So they were felt to be protected. What we found in our adolescents is that there was a vulnerability in some of them.
Now, this vulnerability was not, they weren't dying from measles. They were contracting measles. They were getting sick with measles and then recovering, I take it.
Yep. And when we look at our epidemic, we had cases in 2-dose recipients, but they were less frequently hospitalized than the others. There were 3% of 2-dose recipients who were hospitalized. It was 12 to 15% in the others who had received either 1 dose or were not vaccinated. So really, even if they got the disease, they got a disease with lesser severity.
In summary, it's a balance in countries that have a lot of measles between giving it as early as you can to protect from death and severe disease and waiting until older age group. And so I think, Canada, the United States, many countries in Europe are quite different from India, where there's a lot of measles still circulating.
Now I would think that the extent to which mothers are nursing their babies would make a difference too, as in terms of the interference from maternal antibodies. Or you're talking about...
This is transplacentally acquired.
Okay,
yeah,
so
right.
not from breastfeeding,
not
but
from
strictly
breastfeeding.
from...
Now, Gaston wasn't able to look at these children, these adolescents in Quebec. He looked at it in his poster, so you might want to talk about it yourself, the effect of whether the mother had wild disease or vaccination. Yeah. Because you do expect a higher level of transplacentally acquired immunity if the mother had a history of natural infection versus vaccine. And so it may be that newborns being born now in Canada may not be as, have this slightly higher level of vulnerability by the time they get to be adolescents, but we need to watch.
Yeah, I think that's an important issue. What we saw in Quebec may be something that is not what we will see in newborns, in the current newborns. Really, the maternal antibodies are higher in children whose mother got the disease before. And now most of the mothers in the US and Canada are mothers who got the vaccine. And the vaccine doesn't induce as high antibody levels as the disease, and therefore the children lose their antibodies earlier. And even if you keep the age at first dose at 12 months, for example, you may have far less interference in newborns compared to those adolescents who were vaccinated 15 years ago, who were themselves born to mothers who had the disease. So this is a cohort effect, or this may be a cohort effect, but again, we don't know the contribution of maternal antibodies and maturation of the immune system to what we've seen.
And this effect is peculiar to this population. Nobody else has seen this in a comparable population in a different part of the world, in Canada or in another developed country or an undeveloping country. I want to try and get you to talk about how peculiar this phenomenon is, or how general it might be.
Well, the outbreak we had is an outbreak that involved lots of twice vaccinated individuals.
And these are all teenagers, right?
Most of them are teenagers. Teenagers 12 to 17 years are 56% of all our cases. So really that was the age group most affected. So elsewhere, for example in France, there has been lots of measles transmission in 2011, and the majority of their cases were unvaccinated. So the epidemiologic data regarding the risk related to the age at first dose, we were the first to do that kind of study because we had enough cases.
Well, the bottom line is that it's a very rare thing. I mean, it hasn't been described commonly at all.
Is it possible?
What was done, though, is a serosurvey in Germany where they look in more than 6,000 children who received 2 doses. And they look at the proportion who were without detectable antibodies if they received their first dose. So 6,000 who got 2 doses, if they received their first dose at 12 months, 13 months, 14 months. And you see a decline in the proportion without antibody if the first dose was given later. So this is indirect evidence. So epidemiologic data, we have our data set, but for other source of information, there is also this big serosurvey in Germany.
Okay, we do have a question from the internet, but I'm going to take, because I'll forget my question if we wait a minute. Is it possible, and then we'll take the question from the internet, please be patient. Is it possible that you experienced, and I don't know how you would go back and check this, a batch, or let's say a bad few years of an, for some reason, inadequate vaccine that those kids got when they were little, and that the effects are showing up now, and that it's just a phenomenon that will disappear because it was a one-time off peculiarity of production for some reason.
Well, I think this is certainly the first thing you look when you have an outbreak which is localized in one area. What are the local factors which may play? And handling and storing of a vaccine are important issues to look at. However, the vaccine that was used is the same vaccine that was used throughout North America. And it's one of the most stable vaccines. You know, this is a lyophilized vaccine, and even if you keep it at room temperature for weeks, you know, it doesn't deteriorate. It does deteriorate when you reconstitute, when you put the diluent into the lyophilized product, and then you cannot leave it at room temperature for long. But if it's not mixed, it is very stable. That's for one. For two, that would mean that in that region for several years, there was really people that was almost voluntarily deteriorating that vaccine, which doesn't
make sense.
Doesn't make sense. Yeah. So I think this is something that for all vaccines we should look at, but for this specific vaccine, I think it's unlikely to be the source of our problem.
Okay, so much for simple questions from me. Let's get that question from the internet, Jim.
The question comes via Twitter from Helen Branswell of the Canadian Press. Her question is, should Canada and other countries with low measles rate be considering changing their vaccination schedules?
Let me answer first from my perspective in the United States. I mean, I was actually invited to write a commentary to Gaston's article in Clinical Infectious Diseases. And I think my answer would be no, not now. It's an interesting finding. It was a definite finding. We've got to keep in perspective that 2 doses was 94% effective in that situation. In the United States, we've had a 2-dose program for many, many, many years, and we've never seen this kind of 2-dose outbreak. I think we need to take note, though, and I do think we need to be carefully monitoring duration of vaccine-induced immunity. We're now 50 years out from the start of the program, and so it is as we go forward, we need to continue to look at the epidemiology, as Canada did here, and at immune correlates of protection. But from my perspective, I think based on one study, it is not something to change policy on at this stage.
For Canada, I would probably say that at this time, we will not change the schedule. But what we need to know is if we believe that this is maternal antibody interference that is triggering this, in children born to vaccinated mothers who are now adolescent, we should not see that vulnerability that we've seen in this particular outbreak. So we need to follow up with more studies, because if despite being born to vaccinated mothers, we see this greater vulnerability in adolescents, well, that will mean that other mechanisms have played a role. So before changing the schedule, we need to do more homeworks and study what is the vulnerability in this other group of children.
Thanks. John Geaver, MedPage Today. For the isolates in the Quebec outbreak, did you sequence the virus? Is there some possibility that perhaps there was mutation that made it less susceptible to the vaccine, or you could overcome the vaccine?
Well, the virus that caused that outbreak is the same virus that caused the European outbreak. So in our province, which is not that big, we had 21 importations in that year, in 2011. I think 17 were from France, and it was basically the same virus. That was highly circulating in France. There were more than 15,000 cases in France that year. So it was not a specific virus.
And the vaccine worked very well to protect from it. 2 doses were 94% effective. So that, little difference. and 97% effective if the first dose was given at 15 months. So that tells you right away that it wasn't a virus.
Yeah.
It's not a virus that's breaking out from...
No. And again, there were several importations from France in the US, and this led to...
More than several. We had lots of importations from France last year, just like Canada did. We had more than 70 to 80 importations of measles into the United States in 2011, largely due to the outbreaks in Europe, but also from all over the world.
But this did not make it did not start working its way through the host population, right?
Well, we had 17 small outbreaks. An outbreak is defined as 3 cases or more in the United States. So we had 17 outbreaks, but the largest was 21. And that was in unvaccinated children whose parents had chosen primarily not to vaccinate them. And in children under 1, and those children are too young to be vaccinated usually, but they were exposed at a homeless shelter, drop-in baby shelter. So they got quite sick.
Okay, no, of course they would, I guess. Can you say something about, give us a little bit more about the global picture of where the hotspots of measles continue to be? They're not the US and Canada.
Right. No, the hotspot, I mean, tremendous achievements in measles control. I guess the biggest sort of achievement over the last decade has probably been measles declining in Africa. But all over the world, but India has been delayed in implementing their second dose opportunity. They've just started now, but India is a very large country, and they have just now started providing that second opportunity. And so they're still seeing endemic year-round measles transmission. In 2011, or 10 and 11 into 12, measles outbreaks did resurge in Africa because of delays in funding for the second dose opportunity and probably not reaching enough coverage with their first dose. Also, big outbreaks in Europe, 15,000 cases in France, 6 deaths, 16 cases of encephalitis, 650 cases of severe pulmonary disease like pneumonia. So even in countries with the best medical care, measles can still cause a lot of illness. Italy had an outbreak of 5,000 cases, Romania had an outbreak of 5,000 cases, and the United Kingdom, although they've had some real gains with improving their vaccine coverage since the MMR vaccine and autism scare that started in 1998, they're still catching up. And they have about 1,000 cases this year alone.
So the outbreaks you described in France and Italy are from non-use?
They're primarily from non-use. Undoubtedly, as you also see in most countries that use vaccine, there will be some element of vaccine failure as well. But it's primarily that there's not high 2-dose coverage up to 90 to 95%. Measles is so infectious and it's so transmissible. Unless you get very, very high coverage, you can't interrupt transmission permanently.
Okay, another question from the room.
Alan Liberto, San Jose, California. Considering some waning of the immunity from the vaccine, and considering these hot spots, any comment about the fact that there's increased travel throughout the world, from the United States going elsewhere, or elsewhere coming to the United States to enjoy our economy, young people traveling abroad? Any suggestion about immunizing these potential travelers or young students about to enter college or become pregnant or both?
Yeah. Well, in the United States, all our, and the same in Canada and many other countries that have eliminated measles, like Australia and the Scandinavian countries, measles can only come in through travel, basically, and then there might be a localized outbreak. Almost all the measles that comes in with travelers are unvaccinated people. I mean, it's measles is by by far the biggest problem is failure to deliver the first dose. And last year in the US, mainly US people traveling abroad, getting measles, coming back. It's not people coming, as much coming from overseas bringing measles, however, although that does occur. But it's children whose parents are choosing not to vaccinate them, or it's babies 6 to 11 months. There is a special travel recommendation in the United States for an early dose at 6 to 11 months if you're traveling abroad. Again, that balance between risk of exposure and protection from an earlier dose. And then adults sometimes don't do a very good job of checking their own risk and immunity. And so most colleges in the United States do have a 2-dose MMR vaccine requirement. And so you can't get into college without showing proof of immunity or having 2 doses of measles vaccine. But the problem is it's unvaccinated, not so much vaccine failure.
Jim, a question from the internet.
Yeah, we have one more question from Helen Branswell at the Canadian Press. And I believe this question is for Gaston. What age is the first cohort of women who were vaccinated against measles in Canada?
Well, it does vary, but not much by province. For example, in Quebec, the program started in 1970. In some provinces, it may have started 1 year earlier or 1 year later, but really the start of the 70s is when the universal vaccine, measles vaccine program was launched in most provinces. In some provinces in Canada, they've used the killed vaccine in the middle of the 60s, but that was just for a few years. So that was the prior version of the vaccine, and this vaccine was interrupted after just a few years.
Okay, we have another question from the room.
Vince Racaniello, Columbia University. Can we eradicate measles with this vaccine, or will we need to make a more potent one?
There was a technical group that met on that, on the feasibility of measles eradication in 2010, and they concluded that with current tools it's technically feasible to eradicate measles. I think the plan is, as coverage gets higher in countries, right now in Africa, despite big gains, over the last decade, measles coverage has increased from about the mid-50s to the mid-70s. And so there's still some ways to go to get the first routine dose high. I think as coverage gets to 80% or higher, or up towards 90% in these countries, then policy decisions may be made to move the age of first dose from 9 months up to 12 months, as has occurred in many developed countries now. But no, this group considers, and the fact that really in the Americas, despite some recent challenges last year with a lot of importations, there hasn't been, except perhaps in Ecuador right now, there hasn't been year-round sustained endemic disease transmission for a whole decade now in the Americas, showing the feasibility in that setting in those countries.
So technically speaking, the vaccine works well, but what you need to really move to the upper scale is the vaccine coverage. And so this disease, again, requires that nearly between 90 and 95% of the whole population being fully protected to interrupt transmission. So it's really a disease where you need to have extraordinarily good vaccine coverage.
Can I ask why, because this is a live virus vaccine, it seems similar in terms of the scope of such a program on a global scale to be like the effort to eradicate polio, and that's gone pretty well with some political setbacks. Why wouldn't these two programs be linked at the waist or something, at the hip, because I would think you would save some in terms of the infrastructural needs.
No, I mean, that's a great question. In fact, I'll be talking about this afternoon a little bit, but these accelerated measles control efforts have in fact been linked with polio, delivering 140 million doses of polio and measles vaccines together, delivering insecticide-treated bed nets, delivering deworming medication to children, and millions of doses of vitamin A. And so, in fact, there has been a lot of linkage wherever feasible. Oftentimes, out in these remote areas, people are carrying vaccines on donkeys and mules and in boats, and so they can't carry bed nets as well necessarily, but there's been a lot of linkage.
Okay, so we have another question from the room.
John Geaver, MedPage Today. Is there anything to be said for a 3-dose schedule?
I think it'd be extremely cost ineffective. I mean, 2 doses of measles vaccine has eliminated measles in the Americas. Well, no, that outbreak finished.
Yeah, and it finished by itself. It's, the control measures that were implemented were mostly done to limit the transmission to very vulnerable people, pregnant women, infants. But so it ended by itself. So,
I mean, in any population, even Canada, the United States, with similarly high 2-dose vaccine coverage, everyone under 1's susceptible. People with medical contraindications are susceptible. A small proportion of others, either due to the vaccine not taking in those few, or people that didn't have disease when they were younger, are susceptible. And so we want that percent to stay lower than 5% if possible. But, measles in Canada the definition of elimination of measles is absence of year-round endemic disease transmission. You expect, you've got some babies in your population. We've had a case of a baby that went to the Philippines, came back into a baby room, all children under 1 in a childcare center, 10 out of 10 children got measles. You can't avoid those things. There's no vaccine policy that will protect everybody in the population. But you can respond, and when small outbreaks like that occur, you expect some outbreaks to occur, even at elimination status.
Well, does this program count on symptomless carriage of the virus, of the vaccine, the attenuated virus, so that some of the adults are transmitting that form of the virus and keeping it going in the population to amplify the effects of herd immunity? Is that going on, or is that not the case?
You mean the vaccine virus?
With the vaccine virus.
That doesn't happen for measles as it does with polio.
Yep.
I mean, polio, because it's transmitted in stools and babies, the live attenuated virus does indirectly immunize other people that come into contact with that baby. But measles does not. And measles, we also think that there's not a significant amount, if any, subclinical transmission either.
Okay.
Makes it easier. I mean, like smallpox, you can see every case. One of the challenges with polio is that you can only see 1 case in 200. And so there's a lot more there when you've got 1 case.
Yeah, and expression of the virus in cases is quite limited. So people are not excreting the virus for weeks or months. So that's a big difference, and it makes it
much more
easier.
Self-limited.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I mean, measles, I think one of the things that make it very attractive for future eradication is the extraordinarily high effectiveness of the vaccine, even in settings in developing countries compared to polio vaccine.
So measles may catch up, and as an eradication program, let's make the language clear here, it may beat polio to the finish line.
Oh, I don't think it'll beat polio to the finish line. I think polio right now is on the ropes this year. We hope that stays that way. Polio, we're seeing the lowest number of cases ever and the lowest number of countries ever. So let's cross our fingers and hope that we can get polio completed in the next couple of years. It certainly looks the best it's ever looked as far as chances.
All right, so somehow it's my fault we're talking about polio, but you got to make a race out of this to make everybody stay on their toes, right? Let's say that we're going to wrap up this session on measles, and that will be our last session of ICAAC Live today. I want to thank Jane Seward of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, and Gaston Desserres of the Institut National de Santé Publique du Québec of Canada for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Explore the fundamental role of microbes in the natural history of our planet with Microbes in Evolution, the world that Darwin never saw. Available at estore.asm.org.